International Media TV, television that listens to you.
Hi, I'm Johnnie Burrell. Welcome to the program.
Everyone in this community and across the state of California and the nation as a whole are aware of our incredible Congresswoman Barbara Lee. I'm sure that you follow her on a regular basis, the information that she shares with our community about what's going on in Washington. Without going through a lengthy bio, let me just say she serves on three subcommittees: State and Foreign Operations, Labor, Health and Human Services, Education and Military Construction, and Veterans Affairs. She's also on the powerful Appropriations Committee, and she currently co-chairs the Pro-Choice Caucus, as well as a number of other activities that she serves on, making decisions that impact not only us here in Alameda County, but throughout the country. So I would like to bring out at this point in time the host for today's event. Next, I'd like to bring out her colleague. Mark DeSaulnier is also not a new person to the Bay Area, having served on a number of elected bodies. 100 years ago, he was a colleague of mine on the Board of Supervisors in Contra Costa County, but we'll stop at that one, right?
Yeah, right, 100 years ago.
And we want to say thanks very much. I know that it was more than a year or so ago that I happened to have been in Washington, D.C., in Congressman Mark DeSaulnier's office, and he said, we got to do something and we got to have some conversations back home about race. And I want to say thank you very much for being such an ongoing proponent of that discussion. I guess you were also involved with Congresswoman Karen Bass over a week or so ago and around the same issue, and thank you very much. We also have on the panel today Shirin Oprah, who is the Provost and Dean of the Faculty of Mills College, and I want to bring her out at this point in time and say thank you very much for being a part of it. For over 2 decades, she's provided leadership around social justice, inclusive excellence, and racial equity, queer and trans inclusion at Mills. She's a person who's written numerous books around these issues that we'll talk about today, and I want to say again, thank you so much for being here. Vanessa Moses, Just Cause, is the Executive Director, and we want to bring her out at this point in time and say thank you very much. Previously co-director of programs at CJJC for 12 years. She has a long track record of building the powerful and the leadership of working class communities, and this is going to be a very exciting, interesting conversation that we're going to have today. I understand that we will also be joined a little later by, let me get that bio out as well. We'll be joined by John A. Powell, who is the director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society. He's just coming in from the airport to join us, and so he'll probably be here about 12:30, and really appreciate his participation. He's an internationally recognized expert in the area of civil rights and civil liberties and a wide range of issues, including race, structural racism, ethnicity, housing, poverty, and democracy. And so that will add to the rich discussion that we will have today on race. Randall Kennedy, a law professor and author at Harvard University in Cambridge, Massachusetts, focuses his research on the intersection of racial conflict and legal institutions in American life. One of the many books he has written, while it's on racial politics and the Obama administration, the theme of one of his books is very appropriate, I think, to set the tone for today's town hall meeting. The title of that book is the persistence of the color line. The persistence of the color line. And so while we will open this up for conversation around it, I hope that maybe we can start off in the area that since the founding of this country, it seems as though race has always been a subliminal issue, an inferred, an indirect, a direct factor in everyday aspect of our American fabric. Why is that? And we will begin with our Congresswoman.
Thank you very much. First, Supervisor Carson, let me thank you for your leadership. Keith continues to fight for those who have been marginalized, and he's on the front line here in Alameda County dealing with all of the inequities and inequalities and injustice that we see right before us. So give Keith a round of applause. He's a friend for 100 years, and he's still fighting. Thank you. Also, let me just thank Congressman DeSaulnier, my good friend who, and you know, we all say our good friend, but he's really my good friend, okay? And Mark is one who, really, he doesn't back off of the tough issues. I mean, Mark and I talk a lot about some heavy-duty stuff, including race, and we take deep dives with each other about these issues. And so, Mark, I just want to thank you for your friendship, first of all, and for your leadership, because Mark really gets it. And he's a wonderful partner and a leader on so many issues in the House of Representatives. So give Mark, my friend, another round of applause. And to all of our panelists, I just want to say thank you for sharing your brilliance, your intellect, the information, and really for your presence today. You didn't have to do this, but this is such an important moment, and your voices and your work really bring what we need to this dialogue and discussion. So give our panelists another round of applause also, because I really appreciate this. And I want to thank all of you because my congressional district continues to be the wokest district in the country. Thank you. And while we're doing this here at the Berkeley Black Rep, I don't know if Mona is here right now, but just a quick story. This goes back to the day in the 70s. I actually helped write the first proposal with Nora Vaughn, Mona's mother, for this great world-class repertory theater. And so I'm so glad to be back here, and I just want to thank Mona for allowing us to be in this beautiful venue. Okay, so I'm going to just briefly talk about one aspect of race, and that is highlighting the fact that this is the 400th year since the first African slave arrived on the shores of America in Virginia. And the legacy of slavery and the Middle Passage still with us today. Just look at the black wealth gap. You look at unemployment and health disparities. You look at mass incarceration, the rise of white supremacy, the disproportionate poverty rates, the achievement gap, unequal and underfunded education. You look at access to capital. You look at every single aspect of this society, and you will see a direct relationship between the Middle Passage and today in terms of the gaps and the disparities that we're dealing with. So don't let anyone tell you that there is no connection between the Middle Passage and the slave trade as it relates to African Americans and the many laws after slavery that institutionalize discrimination and racism. And in your packet we have some of these laws. I hope you take with you to see what some of them are, and some are still on the books. So I believe the time has come to have a discussion about how to repair the generational damage. This government perpetuated and sanctioned institutional racism. And we must talk about, we must begin to talk about reparations and take a hard look and make recommendations to really begin to look at how to redress the horrific legacy of slavery that's so prevalent in America today. Finally, and that's looking at H.R. 40, which would just establish a commission to begin to look at this. Finally, let me just say, later this year, I am introducing legislation calling for a Truth and Reconciliation and Healing and Transformation Commission, similar to one that was set up in South Africa and Rwanda. I'm going to do that. I'm going to do that because we have to bring forth some truth-telling and some healing that is required in order to begin a true transformational process for racial healing and restorative justice, so this country truly can reflect its creed of liberty and justice for all, which means for all. For all. So thank you again for being here. These are some tough subjects. They're very controversial, but it's time. It's time America really begin to look at the legacy of the Middle Passage and slavery and really talk about and get honest about the truth and healing and transformation. Thank you again. Mark?
First of all, I just want to thank you all for being here. I also want to thank and recognize my friend Keith Carson, even though he alluded to my age by saying 100 years ago we served. Selective hearing, I didn't hear that part. I served on the Contra Costa County Board, and we got to be friends. We actually were at a program at the Kennedy School some years ago when we were both in local government, and we were with Cedric Richmond, who's now a colleague of Barbara and mine from New Orleans, and Gabby Giffords before that tragic incident. So it's a delight to be here, and how lucky you are to have Keith Carson representing you in local government. He's just a real talented, genuine human being, and I love him very much. So thanks. And then what can I say about Barbara Lee? When I walk on the floor, you walk by Barbara and you go, "Stay woke," and she goes, "You better stay woke." And what a powerhouse she is, and how lucky we are in the Bay Area to have her leadership nationally. When you see this new class, this country just elected the most diverse, the most women in the Democratic class of members. When you see people like AOC, everyone else looks at her like a rock star. When you see her look at Barbara Lee, it's like she's looking at Barbara Lee as a rock star. I hang around and shamelessly go, "I'm friends with her," meaning Barbara, not AOC. So it's just so important in this time, and Barbara never backs down. She's really the conscience of the Congress, and I'm just so thankful for her being there, but also for her being a friend. When I first got elected, she was the first person who helped me try, and we're still trying, to get justice for the Port Chicago 50 in my district, if you're aware of that great injustice in the Bay Area in Concord, California during World War II, and we continue to work on that. After Ferguson, we were on the floor, and the two of us started talking, and I think the conversation went something like, if we have enough challenges in the Bay Area and the East Bay when it comes to race, but if we can't talk about it here and have constructive conversations, where in the country can we? So we had our first one about a year ago at Contra Costa College, and this gentleman was, I hope you forgive me for describing you this way, but he was like the Yoda of the meeting, expressing some real truth and honesty to it. Keith mentioned a week or so ago, Karen Bass, a dear friend of both of ours, who's the current chair of the Black Caucus, was able to come to DVC, and we had a similar discussion there with experts. So I think what Barbara had suggested to me, so this is her authorship, is that we create a template here and take it back to the Democratic Caucus, the Black Caucus, the Progressive Caucus, and say, let's do this around the country. So I'm very thankful for all of you being here, for my great friend, for the panelists, and then just let me say I do have a connection to Berkeley. More than 100 years ago, my ex-wife was waited tables at 4th Street, if you remember that, Mark Miller, and I used to be a partner at the Santa Fe Bar and Grill with Jeremiah Tower. So I really love Berkeley, but don't tell everybody in my district. Well, you can go ahead and tell them. I'm fine with that.
Okay, next we will ask our panelists our additional panelists to open up with a word or so regarding their aspect or how they view racism. And we'll begin with Shannon Oprah.
Thank you so much.
Chinere Oprah.
So my name is Chinere Oprah, and I'm the Provost and Dean of Faculty at Mills College, and I'm just so honored to be in this space with people who I admire enormously, and I have to admit that for many years I said that I wanted to be Barbara Lee when I grew up. Thank you so much for your leadership. The way that you show up with heart and with courage and with honesty and authenticity is something that I think we can all learn an enormous amount from. I'm so grateful for Keith for your leadership, not only on this panel, but of course throughout the decades that we've been following these many challenges locally. And thank you to all of our panelists. Professor Powell, you're definitely an inspiration for all of us. And Vanessa, the work that you do around homelessness and really challenging us to be accountable for what's happening on our streets is incredibly powerful and important. So this is an important conversation. I'm glad that you're all here. I just want to ask you to take a minute just to look around at who bothered to show up today on a Saturday morning to really think about how we can dismantle racial injustice in this country. You're all here. Give yourselves a round of applause. Those of you who consider yourself people of color, you are continuing to show up and be in conversation. Those of you who are white allies, you could have been doing something else, but instead you decided that black lives, indigenous lives, brown lives were important to you enough to come and be part of this conversation. So I'm grateful for all of you. I also want to just start out by acknowledging that this space, like all of the spaces in Oakland that we occupy, are a lonely land. And there's an enormous amount of wisdom to be learned from the original people who were first displaced here. We're seeing a lot of displacement today. There are folks who've been displaced for centuries who have a lot to teach us. One of the things that I learned a lot from Ohlone leaders like Corrina Gould is to think about the 7 generations, not just what's happening for my kids, but what can we do, what seeds can we put in place now that will transform the lives of the 7th generation ahead of us. When we look at things with that long view, then the possibility of dismantling the long-term legacy of slavery and colonization, of genocide, and of the kinds of traumas that we have experienced as a collective humanity becomes a little bit more possible. So I want to talk a bit about the ways in which we might think about that 7th generation ahead of us. How can we not only think about dismantling white supremacy and dismantling those histories, but how can we think about what might we need to change and then to build? And I'm using those 3 words intentionally. Anyone who has been around the organization Critical Resistance here in Oakland? Anyone know Critical Resistance? A few shouts out. So about 2 decades ago, I had the honor of working alongside Angela Davis to co-found an organization called Critical Resistance that wanted to bring to our attention the enormous amount of resources that was being thrown into the prison industrial complex and how those resources were directly being taken out of our education system, our health system, and all the systems would actually create real safe communities for us. And as we did that work, we were all focused on what we needed to destroy, what we wanted to dismantle, how we wanted to tear down those prisons, how we wanted to create an alternative. But we weren't necessarily thinking so much about what do we want to build, because it's almost easier to focus on what's here that's wrong than it is to focus on what do we want to create. Since that time, I've tried to focus my energies more on what can we build? What kinds of alternative societies can we build? Starting small with institutions. For me, it's working on an institution called Mills College, which is a space which I believe we have created this space for transformation. Mills College is a small school. We have less than 1,500 students, and yet it's a space where we have a majority of students of color. A third of our students are first in their families to go to college. We have about 51% LGBTQ students, many of whom have been driven out of other spaces of education that are not safe for them. We have a lot of low-income students. And just this week, I had the opportunity to be at the graduation ceremony or celebration for our first-gen students. They're called SOAR Scholars. And the SOAR Scholars are all first in their family to go to college. Mm-hmm. And one of my former students was there, Isabel, and she was making the speech to them. And she spoke about being the second of 8 children in a Latinx family. She and her siblings were undocumented at the time that she was attending college with me, and she managed through the dedication and sacrifice of her parents to get to Mills somehow. And it was a struggle. She had not had a great preparation to get to college. She had brilliant ideas. She was innovative and creative, but she struggled to figure out how to put them down on paper in the form of a college essay, and we worked hard on that together, and she managed to graduate. So she came back 8 years later to talk about how her life, that experience of going to college and graduating, had been a pebble that was dropped in to a lake, and it created these ripples. And the first set of ripples was that even though her older sibling never got to college, she got to college. All of the 6 siblings younger than her went to college and got a college degree. So those ripples began to spread out. Now, she said, her cousins are all wanting to go to college. And so gradually, there's a transformation that's happening. And so education and the access to a higher education really can be something that transforms not just an individual, but a family and then a community. We all know that a college degree will net you about a $1 million additional income over a lifetime. We also know that with the housing crisis that we have, or the affordability crisis, as Vanessa calls it, what we can see is that many families are having to prioritize simply having a roof over your head rather than sending their kids to college. And yet that then continues that cycle of poverty and that cycle of just struggling to make ends meet. And so I think that one of the things we need to focus on is the way that equity and access to a higher education is a key part of our struggle for racial justice. One of the things that I've struggled with is that for some of our students, they are struggling to succeed in the classroom, not because they don't have the brains or the brilliance or the creativity, but because they're hungry. They are food insecure. And so at Mills, we created a food pantry, because if you can't feed yourself before class, you can't concentrate. We also know that the ability to pay your tuition is a struggle. We reduced our tuition going into this fall by 36%. Which is, for a small liberal arts college, a challenging thing to do, but we recognize that if our students aren't financially sustainable, then nor can we be. And so we can really be creative. Think about all of the institutions that we're a part of. How can we take a step to recognize how economic and racial injustice intertwine to prevent individuals like Isabel from having a chance to create those ripples in her family and her community? And what can we do in the institutions and the spaces that we find ourselves to really transform things, to make some changes, and to open up some doors? I'm incredibly grateful to be here, to be part of this conversation. I'm going to pass on, but in case anybody wanted to ask me a question about it, for the last 5 years I've been involved in a lot of work on Black maternal health, which is another space for an enormous amount of racial and gender inequality. So there's another conversation we might have later, is thinking about how can we look at the intersections of how race and gender and class come together and not separate them out. We're not going to solve the race issue and then somehow later on down the line come to the gender issue. They're all intersecting at the same time. And that shows up in our bodies, in our lives, and particularly in our healthcare system. So there's another space for us to have a conversation. But I'll leave it at that, and thank you again for having me here today.
As the Executive Director of Just Cause, Vanessa Moses, how are you viewing race in this area that we live, the community that we live?
Thank you. Good afternoon. First, I want to echo the gratitude for the opportunity to be a part of this conversation, and what an honor it is to be up here on this panel. The number of elected officials that will call for reparations at a town hall, I think, is pretty tiny. And it's really an honor to be represented by you and the rest of the wisdom, brilliance, and hard work across the table. So for those of you who are less familiar, Causa Justa Just Cause, we are based in Oakland and in San Francisco, and we're building the unity and power of Black and Brown communities to address the twin crises of affordability and crimmigration, which is the intersection of criminalization and immigrant rights work. There's a range of strategies that we use for our work, including policy campaign work, rights-based services, direct action, leadership development, civic engagement. But broadly speaking, there are kind of 3 pieces to the strategy that we're trying to implore. The first is to expand community rights. And I'll say a little bit more about each of these in a moment. The next is community control, and the third is community ownership. And we think that each of these is central and necessary for being able to move us from the impacts that we see now of such incredible and deep inequity, oppression, exploitation, instead of to moving to, as you were talking about, the world that our people need and deserve, which is more than just saying no to what we have now. I'd super appreciate that. And for us, the fights around affordability and immigration are inherently fights for racial justice, right? It's inherently terrain for racial justice work. And I'm sure this is familiar to many of you, but just to give a little bit of context. So for the city of Oakland, between 2000 and 2014, we lost 31% of our black population. Yeah. Just take a moment and think about the kind of significance of that. And that looked like close to 44,000 black people leaving the city of Oakland, being pushed out economically. We go to the San Francisco side, and in the Mission between 2000 and 2017, we had a 25% reduction in the Latinx population in that community. Our families are literally being flung across the region, and it's economically driven, but disproportionately impacting black and brown families and other immigrant folks, right? So the work around anti-displacement is inherently work for racial justice. And it's our belief that in order to create the solutions that will make conditions better for everyone in our neighborhoods, which is what our members are doing, right? They're dedicated to solutions not just to make their own lives better, but to make the cities, the neighborhoods, the region that they call home a better and safer place. And ultimately, that's a better place for every single one of us here in this room. And the problems that we're facing here in the Bay are being mirrored in urban centers across the country. So they're central questions for the nation and for the globe in different ways. And it's solutions that are going to make for a better life for all of us. And we think central to that is racial solidarity, right? In this political period, the right has very effectively used scapegoating and divide and conquer tactics, working hard to help us blame one another and point the finger at one another, fear each other. Meanwhile, the forces that are creating the kind of displacement that I was describing, that's not between us, right? And the only way that we can defend our families, our loved ones, et cetera, from the range of attacks, racist and xenophobic attacks that are coming, is for us to be in solidarity with each other. That's necessary, again, for defense, but absolutely critical if we're to go beyond that. And so for us, one contribution that we're trying to make toward that is building the unity between black and brown communities. And I'm going to give one example of a campaign that we see a lot of opportunity for that work around, and that's the campaign to audit Sheriff Ahern, who's the sheriff for Alameda County. Yes. So those of you who are clapping, I'm sure are familiar with the egregious behavior and the ridiculous impact that this person has had on our folks. But to give, again, a couple of numbers to that. So between 2007 and 2017, the population, the jail population for Alameda County actually was cut in half. So we had about 4,000 folks, and that was reduced to about 2,000. And during that same period, the budget, however, almost doubled for the sheriff. Went from $275 million to $443 million. It makes no sense whatsoever for the budget for a sheriff to be growing at that rate while the jails are shrinking. The good news is the jail population shrinking. That is a good sign, but that budget doesn't make any sense relative to that. And this is happening with a sheriff who's been responsible for, is under his watch, that there have been 34 in custody deaths under his watch. In the last 5 years, thank you. It looks like there's other folks you should absolutely connect with too on this campaign. And another kind of example of how and why it's so important for us to hold him and his administration accountable is the exploitation that's happening for the families that are inside the jail system. So right now, if a family wants to make a phone call to be in touch with their loved ones, they're looking at paying, it's like $12.75 for 15 minutes. That has generated $2 million in revenue for the Alameda Sheriff. And the jail phone company contributed $70,000 to his last campaign. I work for a 501c3. I cannot tell you which candidates to vote for or not, but I can tell you to remember that information, right? The next time it comes when Ahern, because he ran unopposed in this last election. So one example of one figure who has tremendous impact on our communities, and the opportunity for us is because of the role that the state plays vis-a-vis the sheriff's department, et cetera, there's a really important opportunity to bring black and brown folks together, right? So Ahern, one of the reasons that our attention has been brought to him is because of his role in the collaboration between his department and ICE, right? So it's in violation of the legislation that has been passed for the state of California as a sanctuary state. It's in violation of the directives provided by Keith Carson and the rest of the Board of Supervisors. And he's blatant and unapologetic about it. He retweeted the press conference from the Unite the Right conference that happened a little while ago. He's had multiple examples of support for explicitly white supremacist figures and actions. So vis-a-vis immigrant rights, there's a clear motivation, right, for our folks to be involved in this campaign. And as folks have spoken to, the criminalization of black people, the role that the state plays, there's an opportunity, right, for our folks to come together and understand this shared enemy to some degree, even though the way our folks are experiencing the state is distinct. The opportunity for us to come together to fight for the resources that $443 million, if that were redistributed, whether it was for education, for housing, for restorative justice, for violence prevention, it's a waste of resources, and our people need to come together to fight for that to be spent in ways that are just racially and otherwise. And we think that the opportunity to build these bridges around immigrant rights and criminal justice reform, thank you, sweetie, is a critical one for this moment. Excuse me. And provides the opportunity for us to push back on that, on the scapegoating that's happening at a national level, and to ensure that we're able to both defend and fight for the vision of alternatives that our people need and deserve. Because ultimately, the needs and dreams, if met for black and brown working class people, really do create the healthy and vibrant communities that all of us and our children deserve. Thank you.
Thank you very much. Professor Powell, as the Executive Director of the Haas Institute for Fair and Inclusive Society, and I want to say thank you very much for being with us today. Can we get to a fair and inclusive society?
Look at that face.
So it's a great question, and sorry I have to leave, but first of all, let me add my thanks and appreciation to being here under the leadership of our very progressive Congress representatives and you, and also for other panelists. This is actually, I think, close to how democracy is supposed to work. We're in a time when cynicism is actually on the rise, where we're constantly saying things don't work. As you know, there's been an attack on the government since Reagan. We said government is not the solution, it's the problem. Even those of us who are fighting for solutions sometimes forget that the government is supposed to represent people. It's supposed to be accountable to people, and so it's great to see and be part of this effort. I'll try to get back to the question in a minute, but let me just say, I just got off the plane, and I've been on a crazy whirlwind. A week or so ago, we had a conference here in Oakland called Othering and Belonging. Some of you may have attended. We had about 2,000 people. The conference opened up with the amazing young woman his family is from Eritrea. She is deaf and blind, and she's the first deaf-blind person to graduate from Harvard Law School. And she grew up in Oakland. So she's just amazing, and there's actually a video, and all this is online, you can go look at it. There's a video of her surfing. It's her service dog is sitting on the edge of the ocean, sort of saying, I don't know about this. And she talks about disability as an engine for innovation. And I'm going to come back to that in a little bit. And then that's how the conference opened, and the conference ended with inspiration and insights from Reverend Benjamin Barber. Some of you may know his work in Moral Monday. Can we get to a fair and inclusive society? I think we have to. And I think there's special work here in the Bay Area. And you've heard the data about what's happening in the Bay Area in terms of blacks and Latinos and even poor whites being pushed out. I started off when I came back here. I went to school at Stanford and Berkeley many years ago, and I came back here 7 years ago, and I lived in San Francisco. And my son, who also was living in San Francisco at the time, at some point I decided I would cross the bay. The traffic was just too much and too unpredictable trying to get to classes at Berkeley from San Francisco. So I decided to move over to the East Bay from the West Bay. And my son said, you can't leave. You can't leave. We need every black person we can find to stay in San Francisco. And I said, I think we lost that one, but maybe we could save Oakland. And there's an article in today's paper, the New York Times, and it talks about cities across the United States. I'll give you the title of it, and what's happening. It has an interactive map, which is pretty interesting. But I thought I had saved it here. The article is basically about, it's called "The Neighborhood is Mostly Black. The Home Buyers Are Mostly White." And it's an interesting article. It's a nuanced article in some ways. It makes the observation that when blacks and Latinos move to white areas, they're actually of similar economic status as their surrounding neighbors, which means, at least from an economic perspective, it doesn't destabilize the neighborhood. Because when whites move into a black area, their economic status, just in terms of income, is 2 or 3 times higher than the surrounding population. And so you immediately get this sort of churning of gentrification. And they interviewed one white couple who said they wanted to live in a diverse area. They wanted their children to grow up around people of color. And they mused and struggled with it because they're basically saying, even as we want that, we realize that our efforts may actually be contributing to defeat that. And of course, in that is implicated the banking industry. Whereas if you're black and trying to live or move or get a mortgage, you go through one set of hurdles. If you're white, you get a very different treatment. And that's still true today. But the reason I think that's so important as we sort of think about fair and inclusive societies and think about justice is interesting. It's not always turning on personal animus or personal racism. That we have a structure, a system that reproduces these dynamics, what I call racialization, all over the country. And they have maps of showing this happening all over the country. We have 2 congresspeople here, and as far as I know, and I follow this fairly closely, there's nothing that we're doing right now at a policy level, at an institutional level, to actually thwart this. The market is driving it. We're watching it happen. We're watching people being forced out of San Francisco, out of Oakland. I was just came down, just can't. from a plane from Seattle. Seattle, which was already way white, nice city, and a progressive city, is becoming whiter by the day. Same dynamics there. You just go, and it's interesting that Seattle, Portland, New York, is happening. These are progressive cities. You would expect something like this in cities where you have the alt-right being more dominant, but these are progressive cities, progressive regions. So we have to be able to talk about those things. And not just talk about them. We have to develop policies and practices that address them. Talking is important. You can't get there without talking, but you're not going to get there just by talking either. Let's make a couple other points and then turn it back to our able MC. So our conference is called Othering and Belonging. And the name of our institute is the Haas Institute for a Fair and Inclusive Society. We're actually changing our name. And one of the reasons we're changing our name is that we believe that the way people understand inclusive is a kind of soft kind of assimilation. That is, you're joining something that's already there. You're becoming part of something as a guest, whether it's the University of Berkeley or whether it's a hospital. And it's like, you can join my thing, you can come to my party, but it's my party. And those of you who are partnered or married, you know, psychologists say if you get married and each of you own a house, don't move into your other person's house. That's a recipe for disaster. Because the person comes in and say, I'm glad we're together, but you know what? Don't start messing with the furniture. No, that picture was already up there. But I know you're here. We have a closet for you in the basement. And so what you just say is that when you actually come together, if you can, we don't always have that option, it's best to have a new place that people co-create. And to us, that's what belonging is about. It's about co-creating. And so if we're going to have a fair society, we have to co-create this society. It doesn't belong to any one group. It doesn't belong to any one religion. It belongs to all of us. And how do we step into that in a real way? How do we make that real? And one of the ways we talk about doing that is, and I'll give you this, is bridging. And there's an animated video. You can Google it, Bridging and Breaking, animated. And it'll come up and talks about what's happening in the world today. And there are really two dominant themes that's happening in the world today that's important for this convening and for us. And it's important for us to step into this in a serious way. So one of the narratives is about breaking. It's about identifying some group we call the other. And we can do that along racial lines, we can do it along sexual orientation lines, we can do it along immigration lines, we can do it along religious lines, but we say those people are somehow a threat to us. They're undeserving. They don't belong. And therefore, we need to build walls. We need to really tighten up our immigration policy. We need to build prisons. We need to actually segregate our schools. We need to actually limit and control them. And we tell stories that reflect that kind of animosity. Now, the interesting thing you'll see if you look at the video is that this is not just happening in the United States. It's happening all over the world. 60% of the world now lives under an authoritarian government. 60%. That was unheard of. It was unimaginable only 10 or 20 years ago. And what we're using is the fear of the other as a way of actually undermining both belonging and democratic principles. And historically in the United States, African Americans have been the designated other. So we have the Willie Hortons, we have the super predator, we have the stories about, there are all these stories, right? So how we think about these things matter. So for example, even, someone who I count as I admire and knew him before he was president, I'm speaking of President Obama, so we're friends, not close friends, but we're friends. He talks about, and I work on his project, My Brother's Keeper. And one of the things he's saying in that project is that we really need to get black men more involved in their families. And I support that, but the message is actually not the right message, because most people don't realize that as a group, black men are more involved with their families than any other group. And yet the message is that black men are all derelict. And yeah, we have derelicts, but white folks have derelicts too. I think there's a derelict in the White House, Congressman. So we have to tell stories, and I'm going to stop. I just want to leave one other thing, because I want to push you and challenge you. You know, it's not enough. We have to, the challenge, and I say this to my students, I say, you are the bridge to the future if we're going to have a future. So the opposite of breaking is bridging. How do we actually bridge? How do we tell stories? How do we have practices that allow us to come together? And I would even say not simply as allies. And there's something happening in the Bay Area, happening in California, that we almost never talk about. By some accounts, by 2025, new family formations in the Bay Area, in the California, not the Bay Area, will be what's called interfamilies. That means two people will not be of the same race or same ethnicity. More than 50% in a state of 40 million people. We don't even have a word. A friend of mine said, you make up a different word. That's a wonky word. So you can make up a word. But the point is, we have families and relationships that cross these boundaries. We haven't turned that into a serious social or political expression. We need to actually embrace that. We need to celebrate it. And it's not going to solve all the problems, but it becomes a possible bridge. And so I think we need to lean into that in a big way. And so I'll just end by saying this. At our conference, we had the former Secretary General of Canada, and most of you are not Canadian. I'm not, although my son went to school in Canada. Basically, that's the head of the Canadian state. And one of the things they did, they admit 1% of their population as immigrants every year. And then they have a process of actually getting them to be full citizens, full Canadians, and they're inviting them to contribute to what Canada is becoming. But when you become an immigrant, you're not a citizen yet, they give you a cultural pass with that cultural packet. What that package allows is for you to go to all the museums. It allows for you to ride public transportation. It allows you to ride the railways. It allows you to go to the parks for either free or discount. And then they're bringing people back together and say, come and talk to us about your experience. This is your country. We want you to have an experience. And we want to facilitate that experience. Now, I don't think anything like this is going to come out of the federal government anytime soon.
Give it a try.
But we could do this in Canada. We could do this in California. We could do this in Oakland. We could do this in San Francisco. And so we can say, and it could be, and we can think about it in different ways. And I just give you one other expression of this. They tried this in France, and there was immediate pushback from the right. The right saying you care more about these immigrants than you do about French citizens. And so what the French did was something smart. They said, you know what we're going to do? We're going to make this package available to all new French citizens. And we define new French citizens, anyone who's turning 18 or becoming, or an immigrant. And all the hostility went away. So we could say people who are returning citizens, we could give them a cultural package and say, welcome home. And go to the museums and get on BART. And the reality is it doesn't cost that much money. But we can say to them, you belong. And those of you who heard me speak know there's a South African word, which is sawubona, which means I see you. And it's also interpreted to mean the God in me sees the God in you. And there's all kind of research showing that when people belong, when people are seen, not viewed, not watched, not, stalked, when they're really seen, they excel. So I think this is the challenge for us, and I think we need to be an example not just for California, but really for the world. And not just in terms of our attitudes, but in terms of our policies and practices as well.
I want to thank the panelists for their opening remarks. We have received a number of questions from the audience, and probably enough to take us past the time that's allowed for us to be here. So I will start with the questions that we've received from the audience. But before I do, someone left their phone in the women's restroom. So I want to make sure you can get your phone back. Other than today's conversation, and I want to thank everybody for being here, and especially for our two congresspersons for organizing this, the question is, and I've heard, and it's been written by several people, how can we have an open dialogue about race that is productive and not resulting in people picking sides and the conversation being shut down? Who wants to start on that on the panel? Have an open dialogue conversation like today.
I'll just start by saying, I hope we're starting this today.
I think there's a few things. First of all, great question for those of you who asked it. Oftentimes when we say we're going to talk about race, we say we're going to talk about racism, which becomes a harder word to talk about, there's an assumption that it's going to be divisive. And I think that assumption is actually one of those divide and conquer words that's used to scare us away from talking to each other across racial lines, right? So if the assumption is that it's going to be a divisive conversation, then that suggests that we're on opposite sides. And I think that Vanessa made a really good argument for saying that actually the forces that are against us are actually against all of us, right? Whether we identify as black or brown or low income or queer or trans or immigrant, there are so many of our identities that in this moment are under attack, that we have more in common than we have that actually divides us. So I think that's a starting point, is recognizing that when I tell my story and you listen attentively, and with an open heart, then I have space to listen to your story. I'm not trying to create a sense of who has greater oppression than the other. What I want to do is invite you into a space of solidarity with me, right? So we're entering into a conversation that's about how do we create solidarities across difference, and not a conversation about how can you help me, right? Which suggests that somehow you have some better skill set that I could benefit from. So that's one thing. I think the other piece is that looking around this room, it's an incredible, beautiful diversity. All of you look very lovely. And I think a lot of you have one thing a little bit in common with me, which is that a lot of you look like you're about my age. And so I think one of the things I want to add is that we need to make this an intergenerational conversation. That for me, the young people that are coming up have these ideas about how they are wrestling with difference, how they're struggling with how to be in solidarity. I was this week listening, I'm also a professor of ethnic studies. Ethnic Studies is celebrating 50 years, so shout out to anyone who's been involved in that struggle. And it's played a really important role in thinking about how can we have conversations that are courageous, how can we actually open up classroom spaces where people who come from very different backgrounds can talk intentionally about race and privilege and difference and white fragility. And I was listening to our seniors sharing their projects that they've been working on all year. And one of them was a young woman who stood up and started talking about being a daughter of immigrants for a low-income Latinx family and identifying as a white Latina. And therefore, as somebody who had to challenge our own privilege and think about how Latinx families were inculcated with anti-blackness as soon as they arrived into this country. And, you know, I was somewhat shaken because I always thought about the immigrant experience as one as being of an enormous amount of hostility and xenophobia. And I thought that she was incredibly courageous to stand up and say, yes, my community has suffered. My family suffered, but also I want to recognize the ways in which we've been complicit. So I think that we've matured. I think we've evolved. I think we're able now to have conversations that are more complicated and not to be so afraid and fragile and shy away from them. I have more trust in us, more faith in us than that.
If I may, yeah, I agree and want to add a couple of points. So for Council Who's our approach to Black and Brown unity, we think it has three components: building Black unity, building Latinx unity, and internationalist solidarity. And so one piece to add to this is how important it is for us to recognize and honor the real differences between us. I think sometimes there's a desire to dissolve the differences between our communities in hopes that will get rid of conflict or difficulty. And the truth is there's so much strength and brilliance and so much for us to learn and gain from each other. So entering in those conversations both as teachers and learners, all of us, and not shying away from the fact that we're different, not mistaking that for a deficit or a point of contention, because it can and should be and has the potential to be our greatest strengths. This is definitely true for Black and brown folks, and I'm very confident that it expands across different communities. So embracing, acknowledging, learning about the difference and appreciating how that strengthens what we can do together. And the last is, I think, as a society, because things are shaped with such individualism and kind of silos, et cetera, our capacity for cooperation and collaboration is actually very poor. Our economic system and a lot of other ways that society is structured teaches us to be in competition with each other all of the time. The only way I can succeed or do well is if it's at the expense of someone else, and we really need to challenge that. And I think the ways for us to gain those skills are actually through practice. So that's having these conversations. We're not going to get better at it just by thinking about it. We have to do it. Right? And we're going to bump into each other, and it's going to hurt sometimes, but if we keep coming back to it and recognizing that the other side, the new people that we can be through that practice, it's entirely worth it. Our children absolutely deserve it also.
Thank you.
We received a note that we should supposed to speak close to the microphone, but I can't get it any closer. I think part of this, and Barbara sort of hit on this in just her brief, is that by starting this conversation, and I will say that I've been both pleasantly surprised in my community and then disturbed by some of the reaction about just having the conversation, which is interesting. But I think of this, and you can help us with this, is Bobby Kennedy once said that you learn by living. So that's sort of what this is. We're having a discussion. We're doing it with the researchers, and at the last one we did with Congressman Bass that Congressman Lee wasn't able to go to. And let me say about Congressman Bass, I was in the Assembly. One of the highlights of my public life is the day I was able to vote for her to be the chair of the State Assembly. Barbara had been there and a pioneer. When I did that, when Karen became the speaker, I should say, not the chair, it was the first African-American woman in the history of this country to lead a state legislative body. Yeah, it was great that it was California, but at the same time it was troubling that it took so long. So one of the things that came out of the last meeting, and I would really recommend that Professor Powell's Institute, their website is rich with particularly mapping about the Bay Area and the issues of segregation and what's now called resegregation, where people move out of the urban core to places like Antioch in my district. If you go to that, it has all kinds of wonderful information about much of what we're going to talk about, and I'm sure your websites do as well. But the most important thing is we want to learn from this, but the suggestion was maybe we could create a template with the researchers that we could take back to our colleagues about what are best practices about not just listening, but how do we engage in best practices to remedy the challenges that we identify.
Let me just add a little bit to this question. First of all, I just want to acknowledge around the country and at UC Berkeley, we're going to be acknowledging that this is the 400th year of slaves being brought, enslaved people being brought to Jamestown. So in the fall, we're going to have a number of things around, and we're reaching out to people like Michelle Alexander and Kim Crenshaw to help join us. Also, I want to just mention, we talk a lot about othering, the process of othering, and it's already been suggested, but I just want to underline it. The solution to othering is not saming. It's actually belonging. And belonging can and does hold differences, even though those differences are oftentimes being shaped. And the thing that makes conversations about any of these topics hard is not, in the public discourse, there's a constant reframe that we are destroying the left, if you will, by talking about identity politics. And the assumption is, let's talk about something else. And I've written a little bit about this, saying it's not identity politics that's the issue, it's breaking politics. And they're very different. All politics are about identity. But we can do it in a way which allows us to actually see each other's humanity, or do it in such a way that denies each other's our respective humanity. there's a fairly famous conservative named Arthur Brooks. Some of you may know him. He's head of the American Enterprise Institute. He and I have sort of gone on the road, actually talking together, because we have big differences. But he's also, I think, an honest person, a thoughtful person, willing to learn. He's one of those people who still believes in data and facts. And that's enough. You know, he doesn't have to be mean to have a civil conversation. The last thing I want to suggest is, and I know this is a push, but I'm going to make it anyway. In my shop as well, there's oftentimes we talk about creating solidarity with people of color, and I totally support that. I call those short bridges. But I actually want to extend it beyond people of color. I want to extend it to all people. And I do think that in terms of people who are most injured by things, most marginalized, their voice has to be centered. Their resources have to be centered so they don't get overwhelmed by the dominant culture. But I think what we're trying to create is something that includes everybody. And I think we need to actually say that and practice that as well. And so, again, we don't always do a good job of even relating to people who are most narrowly defined as our people, let alone people of color. But I think we have to go beyond that and really say we're trying to create something that actually where everybody can belong, but no one dominates.
Yeah, let me close this by just saying this is such an important question that I know Mark and I, and probably all of us, struggle with every day. A couple of things. Race is a factor in every aspect of American life. It just is. Oftentimes in the past, I was reluctant to talk about race with my colleagues because the charge was, oh, you're playing the race card. Mm-hmm. I finally decided that we'd never get anywhere in terms of dialogue if I kept race out of the conversation. I think it's so important to not personalize any of the issues around race. I hesitate to call a person or people racist, even the racists. Okay? I do. But I talk about their behavior, their actions, and their policies, and try to relate what structural and institutional racism really is. And perhaps they're complicit in this and don't even realize. And I'm going to close by just giving you one example. When I was in the legislature, 3 strikes came down, and I was on the Public Safety Committee with John Burton and Tom Bates and Barbara Lee. And unfortunately, that was right after the Polly Klaas kidnapping and death. And so Democrats were rushing to vote for 3 strikes. And of course, they did. And so I went to the floor, and actually in committee and on the floor, I talked to my colleagues, and I said, don't you realize if you cast a yes vote that this is a racist vote? They said, what? What are you talking about? I said, yeah, this is going to generate more black and brown young men going to prison, 25 years to life. That's what the outcome will be. And they were shocked. And I said, I'm not calling you a racist, but you vote for 3 strikes, 20 years, and this is what actually happened. You're going to see the prison population, unfortunately, of black and brown young people convicted of, on the 3rd strike, of minor nonviolent crimes. That's what happened. And so I share this because I think it's important to talk about, in terms of open dialogue about race, to talk about the impact of what we're doing each and every day, and how some decisions, some funding priorities, some of our work, implicit in that could be racist. And so it's okay to talk about race, because this is America, and we should be talking about it if we're ever going to achieve that perfect union that we all are fighting for.
This is an open dialogue about race. We had several questions on the same theme, and so I want to kind of put them all together, but I think it captures what all of the questioners are asking for. And while this question is directed at Congressman Mark DeSaulnier, I would like anyone to answer it. And it only is directed at Mark because it starts off by saying this individual was unable to attend the Contra Costa event with Congressman Mark DeSaulnier. But the question, again, which is to the entire panel, Why are Native Americans and Asian statistics not available, also not represented when it comes to talking about race? When they only see people of color, it appears to only be black. So I'd like that to go to anyone on the panel.
So this is, as I said earlier, we're learning. The intention, at least for me, in the discussion with Barbara was a response to what I saw in Ferguson. I remember calling African-American police officers after that in my district in Concord and going, tell me if this could happen here. And the answer was yes. We're probably better than Missouri, but it could happen here. So it was sort of just the genesis, I think, of our relationship. But it was, and this came up in at least the last town hall, and it probably came up the first one, is this is not meant to exclude anyone. As we go through this, we're hoping to expand it. To go to Professor Powell's comments, it just was sort of our relationship in responding to that particular incident. So we should, and we will.
Yeah, I want to also speak to this. So, in ethnic studies, we talk about this as the black-white binary, the idea that race in America is only understood through this lens of black people and white people, and that there's not an understanding of how it extends beyond that. And I think that while, of course, as a black person, I recognize that we are constantly aware of the assault on black life and the ways in which racism leads to premature death for black people, and that's a primary concern. We are also really interested in thinking about how we push beyond the narrow focus on only that black-white binary, right? That the idea that it's a zero-sum game, and if we look at that, then we somehow can't see something else. One of the pieces about how we think about slavery is that we oftentimes lose the understanding of both how slavery was built on a foundation of colonization and the vanishing Indian, right? So this was this myth that black people were supposed to be slaves, but Native Americans were supposed to be gone, right? And so that gets continued into the way we talk about race when we ignore the presence, and which is why I opened by talking about this being a lonely land. Not that it's historically a lonely land, but Ohlone activists are still today trying to fight for their recognition, right? That it's not just a history, it's something that's present today. So I think that that is something that we can all be accountable around and think about how do we bring that into the conversation at all times? How do we recognize that while African-American men are the largest number of anyone behind bars, for example, Native Americans are the most disproportionately incarcerated, right? There may be smaller numbers, but the disproportion is greater. So those are some of the things for us to be aware about. I also think that there can be a tendency, and particularly in the field of education, to assume that underrepresented minorities are only African-American, Latinx, and Native American, and that Asian Americans are somehow doing better. And so that feeds into yet another myth, which is actually part of the divide and conquer, which is the model minority myth, right? The idea that, well, Asian Americans don't need any policies because somehow they are doing better. In reality, if we actually look at Asian Americans in Oakland, we're oftentimes looking at refugee communities, we're looking at very impoverished communities who are extremely marginalized and experience many of the same kinds of issues around xenophobia that we were talking about in relationship to Latinx communities. So we have more in common than we have that separates us. So I agree. I think that there's just a lot of learning and unpacking of what we have assumed about what race means in America. And I'm grateful for that question because it makes us all stay on our toes.
Yeah, thank you very much for that. And I mentioned earlier in my opening comments, I am writing legislation to establish a Truth, Reconciliation, Healing, and Transformational Commission to set up a process to address race. In that resolution, we are citing the findings around the genocide of Native American people, the internment of Japanese Americans, the Chinese Exclusion Act, the discrimination of immigrants from Latin and Central America, and going on and on and on. But also we're citing that these are crimes really against humanity, and unfortunately with the Middle Passage, 400 years, we have to begin to look back and begin to unravel the basis for discrimination against all people of color and all people who have still not achieved equality in the society. So that point is very important, and believe you me, we take that into account, and we're working on this in terms of just all of our policies that we're addressing at the federal level.
If I could add one thing, I think the question in terms of representation is really spot on, and I want to support it. I think there's another piece of it, though, that's actually very complicated that we haven't put on the table, and I want to at least tease out. So I think that the effort to move beyond the black-white paradigm is an important effort, but I think people conflate that with the black-white binary, paradigm. People talk about black-white binary. That's problematic extremely because it never was just black and white. But when they talk about a black-white paradigm, it's actually different. Those are not the same thing, and they conflate them. And what I would posit is that in terms of the paradigm actually says it's actually a range. So it's not just about black people and white people. It's actually about the way in which we actually see the world. And so in that context, when the closer you are to white, the better you are. And so it's stratification. But also, in a funny way, an interesting way, that paradigm is not simply about people. That paradigm is about the way we sort of understand the world. And I've written about this in a book called Racing to Justice. So what do I mean by that? If you think about, in the U.S. English and U.S. context, the whole construction of whiteness, what that really means. And that's the hard edge we have to address, the hard edge of whiteness as an ideology, an ideology of domination. And so when you look at our systems in place, whether it's our welfare system, criminal system, sometimes the people most affected by it might be white people themselves, but they're still being affected by a racialized system. If you go to early readings of what white constituted, white was not black. In other words, it was the construction of something that was particularly anti-black. And that phenomena is still very much in play. There's a writer named Yancey. He says we might be moving from a white, non-white paradigm, meaning that if you're white, you're okay, and if you're non-white, you're not, to a black, non-black paradigm, where he's saying if you're black, you don't belong, and if you're not black, you're okay. And it's a little bit subtle and nuanced because he's saying, I'm not talking about people who are phenotypically black. I'm talking about black as an ideology. And so in that sense, you could say, for example, and some people have said this, that the way we have attacked Muslims is using the same paradigm as the way we attack blackness. So we're not saying Muslims are black. We're saying in terms of their being othered in a particular way, we're using the paradigm of blackness to attack them. And we see this in societies all around the world, because societies have dominant ways of othering, and then when new populations come along, we use that dominant lexicon for those new populations. And sometimes we're explicit about it. In San Francisco, the height of the marriage equality movement, there were literally signs saying, gays are the new blacks. So I just want to just sort of complicate it a little bit. But I do think representation is important. I think it's important to be inclusive of everyone. But I also think it's important to understand that the racial construction of America is more than just about people. And it's particularly about an ideology of whiteness that's actually been spread around the world.
We had a number of questions around the issue of environmental racism, and I'll kind of put them together this way. Can you speak to how you feel racial justice and stopping climate change are related, and how both issues can be addressed at the same time?
I'll happily take the first crack at that. Yeah, no, my face lit up and hearing that. I'm like, oh, yes, yes, yes. I mean, I think hopefully at this point it's common knowledge, and I'm sure that's true inside of this room, that with climate change, the communities that are hit first and worst are communities of color, right? And that race is, the relationship between race and class in this country and on the globe means that the most vulnerable communities, as sea rise is happening, as droughts are happening, et cetera, are different communities of color, entire nations, islands, et cetera. So I think there's no question about how racialized the impacts of climate change are. So the investment and kind of vested interest that our folks have in fighting climate change is one piece. Another is in terms of alternatives to what's driving climate change. There are different communities of color who are leading the way in bringing customs and traditions and practices from the past and creating new ones that are going to produce a world that doesn't continue to destroy what is the habitat for humans and all of the other species that we're sharing the planet with. So I feel like there's the impact question and then the leadership question around what we're going to do about it. It's really common, I think, in the US and elsewhere for people to look to quote-unquote experts for the solutions to different problems. And we are overdue for looking to the leadership of directly and most impacted communities for developing the solutions. And climate change is a screaming example where we need to shift that.
Well, let me call your attention to the Green New Deal. And the reason I support the one of the reasons that I support it, early co-sponsor of the bill, is because it addresses environmental racism as it relates to climate change and the disproportionate impacts of climate change on low-income communities and communities of color. A couple of things that we know right here in our area. Dump sites have been cited in low-income communities and black communities, Latino communities. The incidences of asthma, all of the health indices in these areas, in these census tracts are off the scale. Lead, you just name it. And so this is an important aspect of climate change and environmental racism that we can't forget as it relates to communities of color, in addition to all of the other bigger, more global issues. I was born and raised in El Paso, Texas. I lived in a community, it was a community of African Americans and Latinos. There was a smelter that was sited where I lived. And everyone my age or younger are either very, very ill or they passed away. My sister has multiple sclerosis. My grandfather had severe bronchial diseases. My mother had COPD. People in our neighborhood, just disease after disease after disease. They died in their 30s and their 40s. And so for me, environmental racism and environmental justice is a piece of climate change that we have got to address, because I know personally the impacts of these companies that have dumped toxins in our neighborhoods and just what it has done to people in terms of shortening their lives, people of color, and really causing early deaths. And so the Green New Deal, for me, is something where we need to start, and we need to really recognize that here in my 13th congressional district, that there's a lot of work to do as it relates to environmental racism.
So a couple of things I want to talk about. One book that we're hoping, that was written by another Cal professor who's traveling the country right now, The Color of Law, which they talk about Barbara Lee's family and her experience. So zoning laws, both at the state and the local level, have real implications. When I read that book, as somebody who was a planning commissioner in local government, and then I represented the Bay Area Air Quality Management District for 10 years on the Air Resources Board. It's the consequences of not action, but it's also the forces aligned of the status quo. So in Richmond that I represent, where it's one of the geographically and population-based, in California, it is the most dense hazardous material sites. One of the things we argued about for a long time in the air quality world is we weren't considering the cumulative effects of each application. So CEQA would say, all right, we'll take this alone. Well, if you did that in Alamo, you couldn't get anything done. But for Richmond and the industrialized areas that are the environmental justice issues, we changed that to say we've got to consider the cumulative effects. So those are policy examples, but the industries that benefit and are fueling a lot of the opposition in our Republican colleagues, and we just had a hearing on this in the Oversight Committee, of which I'm a member, and we have a great chair in Elijah Cummings. We had Secretary Kerry and Secretary Hagel just talking about the Department of Defense's analysis of the security risk if we don't act on climate change. And the response from our colleagues, particularly Mr. Jordan, was just, I said, I have non-curable cancer that's manageable. I listen to the experts, I listen to the science, or I don't stay here. How you can say you don't want to listen to science is a definition of insanity in my view. But on the environmental justice issue, there's a real correlation between the opposition and the embracing of how we can fix the community and then last in the world and the earth. But the specific, I must admit as a white male, when I read these things like The Color of Law, I had to go reread the book again. There's another book called The Resegregation of the Bay Area by a Berkeley alumni, and he talks a lot about Contra Costa when I was an elected official making decisions out there. And you learn about these things, and you think, he's right. We were doing things that we thought were the right thing to do, but because of my perspective on the world, I was doing things that I thought as a liberal Democrat was the right thing to do, but we weren't listening to the people who are most impacted by our decisions. And that book is really telling about these issues about taking 45,000 people out of the urban core and then displacing them and resegregating the Bay Area. So, interesting.
If I could just say one thing, it was suggested we sort of look at ancient wisdom.
Yeah.
And our separation from the earth, our attack on the earth, is what I actually refer to in my writings as the European expression and whiteness. The idea that earth is just there to be exploited and dominated is very similar to the way we think about women, to be exploited and dominated, the way we think about colonized people, to be exploited and dominated, the way we think of, that becomes the mindset. And so the earth is just a thing to be abused. If you think about Standing Rock and how Native Americans and indigenous people all over the world, they have a different relationship to the earth. They don't think the earth is just something to be exploited. And so there was a big case that just came out of Hawaii where the courts were saying, well, we're taking your land and we're going to give you some money. Take the money. And they said, that's Mother Earth. You can't just tell us you're going to take our mother and give her some land. It's a very different mindset. It's like they're saying we have a relationship with the earth that's 7 generations that's respected. And we're saying we want to drill and use and abuse and then leave. So I think we do obviously have to care about how it affects humans, but it's even more than humans. We have no respect for the oceans, no respect for, here in the Bay Area, we just watched whales come ashore. There's actually, I'll stop after this, but there's actually a story now of dolphins committing suicide because of the way they're being abused. These are intelligent beings. So our capacity as a society to care about anything except the bottom line is extremely problematic.
I just want to return to the theme. I just want to return to my theme of like the seeds of hope. I think about when you talk about Hawaii, that of course the U.S. military, many of us know, actually destroyed the water table on one of the most beautiful islands in Hawaii through their bombing of that island and using it as a military test site. So, we think about that as very much part of this ongoing story of environmental racism. But in terms of the seeds of hope, because we can't, we have to keep that alive for us to be able to keep moving forward. I think about one of my current students who's a young one from Guam. And the U.S. military right now is looking to cite, I think, 4,000 Marines there and to do continuing testing and to sort of open up a lot of the natural beauty there to bombing. And she is really part of a small group of young, undeterred activists from Guam who believe that with their education, they can return and they can actually raise awareness throughout the world about what's happening and they can actually stop this. And they were successful in looking at the environmental protection report that was created, and I believe they were given less than a month to look at about 11 volumes of this report and to lodge any complaints. And so throughout the island, young people found out and they read this report, which was enormous. But of course, the assumption was that nobody would be able to read it in a month. And they actually disseminated it. They made commercials. They put news out on the radio, and they got people to write in and say, no, this is not okay. And they indicated what some of the things that were going to happen as a result of this. So, we know that our young people are the future and that they are increasingly aware of, and just refusing to let us, that older generation, destroy their lineage, really, what's ahead of them and what's behind them, like their connection to the earth, and then what the earth is going to look like for their children, their children's children. So I'm grateful for those young people, and I think that's where we have to invest our energies and our resources to ensure that we have a planet to live on in the future.
So we had over 40 plus questions for our panel today. For the next 5 minutes, there are 2 questions that I'm going to ask. The last is to our 2 representatives because it's directed at them, and that is, what is the role that, this is not the question to the representatives, this is to everyone for the next 5 minutes to answer both questions. What is the role of the news or social media around racism today? Whoever wants to go first.
This just recently happened to me. I've been talked into going on Fox News occasionally. Yes, it's a real learning experience. And I guess part of the impetus from some of the leadership was, well, you know, you are who you are, so go on, try to be reasonable about being a liberal. And this today was very disturbing to me because they started with language from the NRA conference. And then, I don't know who the gentleman is because I don't watch it, but he said, they led in with something about Maxine Waters and then talked about Representative Omar and Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez. And to me, and I was trying not to respond to passive-aggressive behavior because that's what I'm trying to do when I'm on that show, the few times I've gone on. But it was so blatantly racist and targeted to who was watching the show, apparently, and you know this from reading about both social media and 24/7 news, that they're using the same modeling to divide people and upset people because that gets more advertising. So this goes to how we elect people and how the FBI just said yesterday that we're not prepared. And this isn't just Russia, but they used it about what we know about neuroscience and emotion and prejudice and how it's being used by what we take as journalists now, and they're not. I don't think of MSNBC2 goes to the left of the similar model, but Fox, particularly the right, that's not getting objective information. And then lastly, on local news, which is an initiative that I have started to try to help get local journalists, this is a real issue for communities of color because you would get information by local journalists and publishers, and they're being crushed by these large corporations like the company Alden Financial that owns the Bay Area News Group, that owns every newspaper in the Bay Area except for the Chronicle, and has stripped out all of their capital. And for the East Bay right now, when Barbara and I and Keith, when we were starting out, I don't know how many local reporters you had at the Board of Supervisors, but we had 7 in Martinez. There's now 2 for both counties. So how do you get local news? And what you're getting is, instead of people who at least have journalistic standards to try to be objective, you're getting subjective information that's driven by making money, and a lot of that is a motive in driving us apart. So it's a real problem.
Can I say something to that?
It's your event.
As someone who...
Like anyone could stop her anyways.
No, I think someone who understands the media, and especially social media, because I have to deal with the bots and the trolls each and every day, okay? The environment that has been created now in this country as a result of the Trump administration has allowed for hate and for racial attacks, and the bottom line is these attacks on whomever can lead to violence, and it's a very dangerous moment, I think, for those who are out there. And so we have to figure out, and I know how Facebook operates, I know the ads that were purchased that created the divisiveness in communities during the elections, and all of that has got to be looked at, Because otherwise, we're going to have a country that is going to, it's going to be okay to be violent, and because someone has said something hateful against somebody, which allows for those to come forward who want to take violent action. So I just think we have to remember that the dangers around this now are very real, and I know Mark experiences this all the time. I know Maxine does. I know I do. I know many of you do. And so we have to really understand where we are in terms, and the media has to be, I think, responsible, as well as making sure that our First Amendment rights are protected.
Anyone else on the panel before we ask the final question of the last two of our congresspeople?
Well, just one thing I'll say is that a lot of the stuff, especially in social media, is actually, I teach a course on the mind science, and students write stuff, and I say, talk to the lizard, meaning the lizard part of the brain. So social media is not designed to actually convey facts. It's designed to incite, and we haven't caught up with that. So they're using all kinds of stories and prompts to actually create hate and division. And to be candid, I think we were caught flat-footed, and we know it's coming again. And I think, we need to do something. Not only is it a threat to us individually, but it's a threat to our democracy. So, in a sense, the mind science and the robots and the artificial intelligence is actually outstripping our social capacity yet. We haven't caught up yet. And so I'm worried about it. And I think, unfortunately, there's some in high places that like it. So I don't know what the answer is.
In the highest place.
The only thing I would add, though, and I agree with everything that's been said, is that a lot of our young activists are becoming incredibly savvy about how to use social media in really positive ways, too. And I'm very inspired when I see young people recognizing, yes, this is a tool that has been used against us, but it's something that we can seize. And in fact, many young people don't trust the media anymore, the mainstream media, because they understand how it's become corporatized and controlled. And so they are turning to creating their own kinds of media, creating their own stories. I think about the undocu movement and the undocu queer movement, which are undocumented young people telling their own stories because they recognize the media is not telling their stories. And they have been incredibly successful at pushing those stories out through their own social media, through networks on networks on networks, to really tell the story about what's happening. And that, I think, was a big part of really building up the Dreamers movement and some of the solidarities that we've seen across lines of immigrant, non-immigrants. So there's definitely, anytime we have a platform, that platform is going to be, first of all, used for evil, those who are able to use the science against us, but then we have to recognize that it can become transformed and used in a positive way, too. So I'm excited to see what else our young people will come up with next.
Agreed. Want to echo the real threat to democracy that I think the current sources of information that folks rely on, what the threat that poses, and want to add to the opportunities inside of it. It is relatively new technology. We have not caught up by any stretch of the imagination. One thing I want to add is encouraging us to look at social media as another part of the commons. Right now, it is owned by and controlled by corporations, and given the role that it plays in our lives, that doesn't make any sense, right? There needs to be regulation and accountability that's not possible right now with this setup, and that's one of the places that I think we need to catch up and to be building on the ways that folks have been able to produce mass mobilizations, inform folks, new connections. There's a lot of really positive potential, but in the hands of corporations alone, that's not what's going to get leveraged.
Okay, I want to thank the panel. The final question is actually to our two representatives, and if they want to make a summation comment, you can do so at this time. Is there a place, or would the representatives be willing to take part in an empathy circle with Republican representatives on the topic of racism?
Sure.
I'm a member of Congress. I'm a masochist. Yes, I would.
Did you have any final comments?
Okay. Well, my final comments, first of all, I just have to thank our panelists. Weren't they brilliant and informative. Thank you all so much. And I want to thank all of you, because these are tough times, tough conversations, but you're here. And I hope that a couple of things that we get out of this is that when you go home in your neighborhoods, you know, talk to people, have these conversations, the tough conversations. I know Mark and myself, we're willing to be part of that. I know some of the tech sector, which I, you know, onto in terms of racial equity and gender equity, it's unbelievable in terms of the unconscious bias that's within that sector. And so they've conducted unconscious bias kind of training, but what happens is once it's uncovered, there's nothing next steps.
Right.
So we have to talk about next steps. Once you have the discussions and the dialogue and try to begin to find some type of racial healing and understanding, what do we do next? And that's, I think, the big issue. So I think this has got to keep going. We've got to have these forums in the neighborhoods and all over my district, and I know Mark's district, because if it can be done anywhere, it can be done in the East Bay in terms of finally coming up with a district or a region that really understands what racism, what institutional and structural racism is, regardless of who we're talking about, who's been discriminated against, and look at these systemic issues, because it's not only just personal white supremacist attitudes. We're talking about structures and funding priorities and programs and institutions that perpetuate themselves, which create these huge racial disparities and these huge gaps that we've got to close if we're going to really, again, live up to our creed of liberty and justice for all. So thank you again for being here. I really appreciate my district being, again, the most enlightened, progressive, Mark, and wokest district in the country. Thank you all.
Congressman DeSagne.
And I want to thank my staff and Mark's staff, because they did a phenomenal job. Give our staff a round of applause. They're here 24/7 working for the district, but they do this they go beyond the call of duty.
No, I want to thank you again, Keith. Thank you for always appreciating my weird sense of humor and anticipating it. Barbara, just a wonderful colleague to work with, and again, what a national treasure we have in Representative Lee. To the panelists, thank you. I learn every time I come to these, and Yoda, you're inspiring.
May the force be with you.
You may the force be with you, yeah. I was afraid you were going to use the line, there is no try, there's only do or do not. But just to echo what Barbara said, the Bay Area is one of the most diverse, wealthiest places on earth, but we're in danger of losing all of those things if we don't have a discussion about winners and losers here and how we make sure this is a place that, as Professor Powell said, is about all of us together. And then a great quote that Professor Powell's when he was talking about climate change, the Chief Seattle letter that he sent to the President of the United States, I'm forgetting, when he said, humans, the world does not belong to man, sorry, dated, humans belong to the earth. And I think this is part of what this discussion about is being all part of how better we improve our communities in the Bay Area. So thanks again.
It once was stated, we've made enormous progress in teaching everyone that racism is bad. Where we've seemed to have dropped the ball is teaching people what racism actually is. So I hope that you all go out and continue this conversation. Thank you for attending.